Hello, my name's Olorotimi Osha. I like talking about US history, American presidents, and everything in between. A few days ago, a GOP congressman, Adam Kinzinger, debunked a Fox News breaking report that the CIA had raided the office of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Um, of course, Adam Kinzinger was debunking it, saying, "Well, it was misinformation. It was misinformation. The raid never happened, and this was just misinformation from a self-described CIA whistleblower." So that word came up, whistleblower. By the way, the Director of National Intelligence is actually senior to the Director of the CIA, right? That's basically in seniority. So it would be it's kind of like bizarre that the CIA would order the raiding of the Director of National Intelligence's office, their boss. But you never know in the US government what's going on. It was interesting that the boxes that were supposed to have been raided included MK Ultra files. If you recall, I've actually done a video discussing MK Ultra, the project that went on since the 1950s, and it was exposed through the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee of Congress. So you can look at those videos. Today, what I want to do is discuss whistleblowers, right? But I'm going to just start with the origin. Whistleblower is important because, as one of my friends said, he said I went to blow the whistle. Is an old friend from Nigeria, childhood friend. He's an American now, and with his family, they're Americans now. But I've known him for a very long time, and he's been very supportive throughout this time. And he was like, I blew the whistle, and that's why I'm going through all the crisis that I'm going through. The false flag operation in Montgomery County, Maryland, that has detained me. I was raided in my home. They made it a false flag, like it was an emergency crisis. So they instigated a swatting, right? So that was some form of retaliation because I had reported to the office, reported misconduct to the Office of Inspector General. And so that's the textbook definition of whistleblowing. So what I want to do today is, as with everything, there's a history. There's a history to everything. So I'm going to discuss what the history of whistleblowing is. I'm going to discuss whistleblowing, and later on I'll get into. I'll do more videos and discuss in depth. But today, what I'm just going to focus on is discussing the origin of whistleblowing. What is whistleblowing, first of all? Whistleblowing, of course, is um, when an employee of an organization, right? Whistleblowing can occur in the private sector as well, private companies. I'm going to stick with the government, the US government, right? So, for instance, somebody in the US government, in an agency in the government, goes to report, right? Reports wrongdoing. Wrongdoing can be corruption, um, fraud, some form of embezzlement, graft. It could be, sexual misconduct. It could be, abuse of authority. It could be waste. It could be mismanagement. So they report this to an appropriate authority. So they make a report, and you know it could also be things they can also report. It can be public safety, something that proposes a threat of public safety, health hazard. So they make this report. That's what whistleblowing is. That's basically what whistleblowing it is. Now I want to be able to distinguish um, whistleblowing from violations of the Espionage Act. So many people don't, I guess lay people do not make the distinction. In subsequent videos I do, I'm going to make that distinction, right? Of course, there are popular people that have been labeled whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, right? Chelsea Manning, who, leaked the largest amount of classified documents that got onto WikiLeaks, right? Regarding detention and torture and abuses. There was a case of Edward Snowden, right, who the ex NSA guy, National Security Agency, NSA employee who went to leak to Washington Post and other news agencies that the United States was, intelligence agencies were illegally gathering and surveilling Americans, storing information, data of Americans, and conducting illegal surveillance. So those things, those people were charged with crimes, right? They were found guilty of crimes. And I'm going to do later videos and explain the distinction, right? So that's not, people label it as whistleblowing, but there's a distinction, right? Whistleblowing is not a crime, right? So what they did was, though, they exposed classified information. So they violated the Espionage Act of 1917, right? So when you join the government, especially if you're working in certain agencies, right? If it's the CIA or an intelligence agency or the Department of Defense, if you're dealing with classified material, there's certain things you can't do. You can't remove classified material, so that will be a violation. But that's not what I want to discuss today. I just wanted to make the distinction. So I want to go into the origin of whistleblowing in America. America actually was the first nation to create the first whistleblower protection law in 1778. That's July 30, 1778. And we do mark on July 30th of every year the National Whistleblower Appreciation Day. So let me get into the history, how it happened. So in fact, whistleblower is as old as our nation, right? The emergence of whistleblowing, coincided with the founding of our nation, right? And as you know, I've already stated that the first whistleblower protection law created by the Continental Congress in 1778, that is about a decade before the first administration, before our U.S. Constitution. That's a decade before the U.S. Constitution, so it's older than the Constitution. So in 1777, to be exact, February 19, 1777, during the Revolutionary War of Independence against Great Britain, 10 sailors and Marines filed a petition, wrote a letter to Congress, to the Continental Congress, reporting the commander-in-chief he was the first commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy, Commodore Esek Hopkins, reporting him for misconduct and for the torture and abuse of British prisoners of war. So they reported him, and what happened was, this was on February 19, 1777, and then March 1777, he was suspended. That's Commodore Hopkins. He was suspended, and subsequently he was terminated on January 2nd, 1778, from his position. He was the first commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy. However, prior to him being removed from office, he immediately filed a criminal libel suit, and two of the sailors were jailed. One of them was Richard Marvin, the other was Samuel Shaw. So these two men were jailed. So that was retaliation. So he retaliated. So that's important about whistleblowing, right? Elements that we should observe. So they reported their boss, the head of the Navy, commander-in-chief of the Navy. He retaliated and jailed them, reported him for misconduct. He retaliated, filed a criminal libel suit, and they were jailed. So while in jail, they petitioned Congress to come to their aid. And the way Congress responded was to create the first Whistleblower Protection Act. In fact, I'm going to read it from read the law from the legislative history. I'm going to read the actual text, which is very important, and it's made it a requirement, made it a duty of people, servants of the U.S. government, civil servants, people working for the U.S. government, to report um, any instances that they observe of misconduct, misdemeanors, fraud, right, wrongdoing, bring it to the attention of Congress or the appropriate authority, right? So that's the whistleblower protection law. So people who work for the civil service are required to report wrongdoing, right? So that's the whistleblower protection law. Now that is different, and of course that has evolved over time. Again, there are appropriate channels to report wrongdoing, and I'll do subsequent videos so I don't conflate things, right? For instance, I am a whistleblower, but it's protected because I went through appropriate channels. I reported wrongdoing. If it was discrimination, it was sexual harassment, hostile work environment, any wrongdoing that you're reporting, that is whistleblowing, right? So I reported that to the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And then I reported fraud and other misconduct, right? Falsification of documents to um, the Office of Inspector General. That's the appropriate channel. I also reported to Office of Special Counsel. That's the appropriate. Those are appropriate channels, right? Now, I never took classified information and reported. You're not allowed to do that because when you join the United States government, right, there are rules, right? There are rules, especially depending on where you're working. For instance, I was working in national security, so that you can't take out classified documents, right? So you're working in an area. So in fact, you work in what's called a SCIF, right? SCIF, it's a secure compartmentalized information facility, right? Where there are no windows, there's nothing. You can't take a photograph, you can't take a camera, you can't take anything. You can't take digital gadgets, nothing. You can't go in there, and you can't take any documents out of that place, right? So it's illegal. So if you take things out, you've actually committed a crime. So you'll be charged with theft of government property. You're not allowed to expose classified material. So that's the origin of whistleblower protection law. I'm going to get into the weeds with and look at individual cases and what makes them not whistleblowing, right? It's not so leaking information is different from whistleblowing, right? Leaking information is leaking classified information is different from whistleblowing. Leaking classified information is actually a crime, right? It's treason. It's a violation of the Espionage Act of 1917, and you go to prison for that. It doesn't matter if you're doing it to protect the public or whatever. The appropriate channels that the government has to report those things, but other matters, right? That's not. For instance, me even going to the press to say, well, I was discriminated against. That's whistleblowing. It's not illegal. It's protected. So the protection is to make sure that the subordinate, right? So it's often a subordinate, somebody in a lower position reporting their boss, right? That's often what it is. So you see the 10 sailors in the history, right? In 1777, it was 10 sailors who reported their boss, the head of the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy, right? And then they needed protection from retaliation because when you report wrongdoing of your boss, they're going to retaliate. So now it's not often the case that your boss is whistleblowing their subordinate, right? They're reporting the wrongdoing of their subordinate because the boss has authority to terminate their subordinate, right? The boss can just fire their subordinate for wrongdoing. That would be legitimate. They have the authority to do that, the power. But a subordinate doesn't have the power to fire their boss, right? So what they do is they report their boss for wrongdoing. Now it's likely that their boss can retaliate. So that's why there's a whistleblower protection law. There are various whistleblower protection laws. Their boss can retaliate. They can fire them. They can lock them up, like what the Commodore Esek Hopkins did. He had Shaw and Marvin locked up, jailed for criminal libel, right? And they had to appeal to Congress. And what Congress also did, apart from passing the law, and I'm going to read the text of the law, they also provided for the legal defense of the two men, of the whistleblowers. So they were protected, they were acquitted, they were defended in court, and they also they dismissed the commander-in-chief of the Navy, Commodore Esek Hopkins, when once they were able to confirm that this was legitimate. He was removed from office January 2nd, 1778. So now let me read from the text of the whistleblower protection law. The very first, it's said to be the first whistleblower protection law in the world. So this is the text. It was signed into law by President Henry Lawrence on July 30, 1778. So Henry Lawrence was the president of the Second Continental Congress, right? Remember the Continental Congress, they were established for the prosecution of the war, right? This was prior to us having the U.S. Constitution that created the strong national government that we have today. So the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1778, this is it. That it is the duty of all persons in the service of the United States, as well as all other the inhabitants thereof, to give the earliest information to Congress or other proper authority of any misconduct, frauds, or misdemeanors committed by any officers or persons in the service of these states, which may come to their knowledge. You see it right there. Let me read it again. That it is the duty, it's a duty, right, of all persons in the service of the United States, right? If you're working for the United States, as well as all other the inhabitants thereof, to give the earliest information to Congress or other proper authority of any misconduct, frauds, or misdemeanors committed by any officers or persons in the service of these states, which may come to their knowledge. So it's actually a duty, right, to blow the whistle, right? So, well, there are proper channels. You see, it says Congress or the proper authority. It doesn't include, and I'll do subsequent videos to explain the distinctions, right? It doesn't include, if you're working in the Department of Defense in a classified area, for you to take out documents, right, to report the misconduct of your bosses or whatever. That's a violation of the law. You can be charged with a crime. You can become a hero in the court of public opinion before Americans, and that's what normally happens. Like Edward Snowden, what he did was a crime, right? So he went to leak information to the press that the US government was conducting illegal surveillance, right, on citizens all over the world. In fact, it violates our constitutional rights, right, our privacy rights. He became a hero, sort of like an anti-hero or whatever in the world, but he's like a criminal in absentia. He's actually living in Russia today. So what he did was he violated the law. When you work in certain areas, he'd worked for the CIA at some point as a contractor, and he was a contractor working for NSA. There are things you can't do. You can't take certain information out. You can't take documents out. You can't leak what you see in those documents. You can't do that. They're appropriate channels. So the intelligence agencies, that's why they're very careful who they hire. Intelligence agencies, there are things that they do, right? Unfortunately, especially the CIA. That's why the CIA is actually normally restricted from working in the United States, within the United States. They're supposed to be working in foreign, overseas, right? Because espionage is actually illegal. So there are things that they're doing that, hey, maybe Americans don't want to know about, but that's what they've been authorized by Congress to do. And they report to the US president. The intelligence agencies as well, they use all tools necessary to be able to deter other foreign agents, right, from infiltrating our government, right? So there are things that they do. So if you're working with them, there's certain things that you cannot do. The same thing with Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg was the one who, um, in the 70s, he was the one who leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. He was charged. What he did was he showed that the government, the president, had been lying to the public regarding the conduct and the scope of the Vietnam War. That they'd just been lying to the public. The credibility gap. And he took out these papers. He had been working. He was a Pentagon analyst, and he was also working at the RAND. Very brilliant man. But I've done a video discussing this before. But he took these papers out and he leaked them. Bunch of whatever. That's illegal. You're not supposed to take classified information out of the Pentagon or wherever agency you're working for. He was charged with the espionage, for violating the Espionage Act and theft of government property, but it was dismissed. Of course, he became a hero in public. That's one. He won in the public court of public opinion. But in the U.S. Supreme Court, or whatever the court that was trying, it also dismissed it because there's something. Remember, I've done a video regarding the way you gather evidence. So, fruit of the poisonous tree, illegal way they gathered evidence. So that was the time. The plumbers were actually surveilling him. They went to go and they were gathering information against him under President Nixon. And so the way they gathered the information of his wrongdoing was illegal, right? So it's inadmissible evidence. So it had to be suppressed. So the case was dismissed, right? You can't gather it. It's a violation of the Constitution and his constitutional rights. You're gathering information, evidence in an illegal way. So the way the evidence against him was obtained was illegal. So the case against him was dismissed. But at the same time, you don't want to leak information if you're working for the U.S. government because, your clearance is going to be revoked, so many stuff, so you don't want to do that, right? But whistleblowing for wrongdoing, misconduct, certain type of misconduct, that is protected. It's actually lawful. It's actually a duty for you to report fraud, waste, and abuse and mismanagement in the federal government, because the government, we don't make profits. We don't produce anything, right? If you're in a private business, you're producing goods, you're producing services, and then we can see what you're doing, and then you're making profits. That's your job, right? The more you produce, and then you can reduce your expenses, produce more, increase your revenues, and then you can increase the profits. That's what the shareholders want. So you can give more dividends, more profits and dividends to the shareholders. That's what the company wants, right? An organization in the private sector, and that's how you can rate their performance. We don't do that in the public sector, in the government, right? The federal government, we don't produce anything. We don't make profits. The way we get our money is from Congress. So taxpayers' money, right? Congress allocates it to us, appropriations. That's how we get our money, and we tell them what we want, and we have to spend exactly what it is that they give us money to do. Right? So we're not making money, we're just spending money that they gave us. So the alternative, the equivalent of making profit in the private sector to show management is performing well, is to cut fraud, right? To eliminate fraud, to eliminate waste, that the money government is giving us, that we're not wasting that money, right? We're not abusing it, and then we're not abusing our authority, so that our bosses are not appropriating the funds to spend the money on other things. They're not embezzling the funds. So that's how we can assess management and the performance of government agencies. That they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. There's no fraud. There's no waste. There's no abuse. There's no mismanagement. There's no abuse of authority. And so that's why it's incumbent on us, who are civil servants, public servants, to report it. And we have the Whistleblower Protection Act to protect us, right? So that our bosses don't retaliate, they don't fire us, they don't demote us, they don't isolate us, they don't stage false flag operations against us like the Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy did with Montgomery County Police, how they staged a false flag operation against me using an old demented fabulous Howard University professor, Jide Wari, to stage, you know, an assault, false flag, false emergency crisis to raid my home, right? So they're really trying to see what I had in my home, right? I know they were there, right? That's the Department of the Navy, because he hacked my computers, all that stuff, raided me and filed false charges against me. So that's retaliation. That's what the Whistleblower Protection Act protects us against, right? So you can see this is a more sophisticated, more complex form of retaliation, not the simple retaliation that was done in 1777, 1778 during the Revolutionary War, when the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy, Commodore Hopkins, simply jailed the whistleblowers, Richard Marvin and Samuel Shaw. Samuel Shaw, for a criminal libel suit, right? On criminal libel suit charges. They just had them jailed. So now they have more advanced forms of retaliation, right? More advanced forms of retaliation. Under Richard Nixon, we saw what the plumbers were trying to do. The plumbers were trying to kill Jack Anderson, the reporter who was reporting Richard Nixon's misconduct, and he was on Richard Nixon's enemies list. And what Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, the former FBI agent, and then the ex-CIA Howard Hunt, what they planned on doing was smearing the steering wheel of Jack Anderson, for reporting the misconduct of President Nixon, which Nixon felt caused him to lose his the first election for president against John F. Kennedy. Jack Anderson had reported on the eve of the elections that Nixon's brother had been collecting money from the billionaire, the richest man in America, Howard Hughes, and it made Nixon appear like he was a crook. Right. Later on, of course, Americans still believed that Richard Nixon was a crook, and so the plumbers who were working for Richard Nixon, they eliminated Nixon's opponents, they sabotaged them, they smeared them. That was their job. And of course, they eventually went to prison. But the Watergate scandal broke, and it prevented them from doing what they were going to do. They're going to go to an extreme. They were actually going to assassinate a journalist, Jack Anderson. They were going to the plan was to smear the steering wheel of his car and make it with LSD, right? LSD, and he would get high and disoriented and suicidal, and he'd crash his car and die, right? So they'd stage it. You think it was an accident or death by misadventure. So that's one of the methods, the method of the CIA. Or they said they would stage a mugging, right? That was the other way they were going to do it. So you see, that's a retaliation, an extreme form of retaliation, where under Richard Nixon, the government was actually planning to assassinate people to assassinate whistleblowers. So that's an extreme form. Does it happen today? I don't know. But anyway, I think I've done my duty today, showing the origins of the first whistleblower protection law in the world, how it came about. Now, I'll do later videos and talk more about whistleblowing. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.